Hello, everyone, and welcome to Engage in Trade, the U.S. election implications for global trade. My name is Susan Spitz, and I am the Manager of International Business Development here at the World Trade Center, St. Louis. We appreciate all of you joining us today. All of the news outlets are spending a lot of airtime discussing the results of the U.S. election, what it'll mean for the economy, for business, for immigration, et cetera. Today, we will focus just on one area, and that is global trade. What do the results of this election mean for international trade, both across the U.S. and in our region? And there's certainly plenty to talk about there. And who better to do it than the three experts who actually addressed this same topic for us 4 years ago. These are three experts with strong ties to Missouri and specific direct experience with the legal and legislative aspects of U.S. trade policy. So we'll get to that in a moment. I just want to give you a few housekeeping rules. All participants will be muted for the duration of the presentation, but if you wish to ask a question, and there will be plenty of time for questions, please use the Q&A button that you will find at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to get to those questions at the end of the panel discussion. And a recording of this presentation will be available a few days to a week after this webinar is completed, and we will also include any resources or links that may be mentioned by the panel. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you the Deputy Director of the World Trade Center St. Louis and my supervisor, Ms. Stella Sheehan. Stella has been with the World Trade Center for over 18 years, and she leads the trade team consisting of myself and Annie Mbale, who is our webmaster today. She also heads up our executive certification in international trade, the online export training program that we've offered over the years. She oversees our 16 sister cities, and she is the executive producer of our signature event, Growing Global. Born and raised in Ireland, Stella has lived, worked, and studied extensively in international markets, including Belgium, France, Italy, and the UK. She holds a BA in French and Italian from the National University of Ireland, Galway, and an MA in Applied Languages for Business from the University of Ulster at Coleraine in Northern Ireland. She's also a graduate of Leadership St. Louis and serves on the Missouri District Export Council. And as I always say, she is the wind beneath the wings of our executive director, Tim Nowak. So Stella will be giving a brief introduction of World Trade Center and our panel, introducing our panel. So over to you, Stella.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that very gracious introduction. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this much anticipated event. Suffice it to say, this particular Engage in Trade has garnered much attention, and I know all of us at the office have been looking forward to it all week. Having moderated the same event back in 2020, I know we're in for a treat with this afternoon's panelists, as Susan mentioned. And as she also mentioned, I lead the trade side of the house. We like to say at the World Trade Center that we have three main pillars: people, trade, and investment, the three key equal ingredients that go up to making a global city. The people side consists of our 16 sister cities and perhaps our most well-known initiative, the St. Louis Mosaic Project, headed up by my colleague Betsy Cohen, which is an initiative to attract foreign-born to the region and assist them by way of programming and networking once they get here. The trade side provides companies with the tools they need to trade internationally by way of counseling, referrals to our federal and state partners, and organizing educational events like the one you're attending today. Last but certainly not least, our foreign direct investment, or FDI pillar, led by my colleague Sean Mullins, assists companies around the globe who may be interested in setting up their North American base in St. Louis, while simultaneously assisting foreign companies who have already chosen St. Louis and wish to expand and continue to invest here. And now to the introductions of our esteemed speakers. Jordan Bernstein, as the Chief Operating Officer of Cassidy & Associates, a lobbying and government relations firm, Jordan manages the day-to-day operations of the firm while also representing his clients, who are as diverse as global brand names to national nonprofits, large integrated health systems, excuse me, universities and trade associations. And in full disclosure, I should mention that we have the honor of working with Jordan, as he also serves as the lobbyist for the World Trade Center and the St. Louis Economic Development Partnership. He specializes in devising and executing comprehensive legislative strategies directed at promoting client-specific federal policy and funding objectives in Washington. Jordan's exceptional ability to create and grow relationships between the federal government and public and private entities is grounded in his tenure as Chief of Staff to Congresswoman Joanne Emerson. In this role, Jordan not only had unique inside access to the legislative process, but also was an essential participant in the determination of congressional policy and appropriations. He earned a bachelor's degree in political science from Michigan State University and an MA in political management from George Washington University. Jordan, would you like to say a few words of introduction?
Stella, Susan, thank you for having us. I'm glad that the three of us did well enough the last time to get reinvited back 4 years later. And it's also amazing how impressive you sound when you write your own bio. It's hard to sound bad, when you put your own narrative out. Glad to join you all. It's interesting times. What's old is new again. We're in for an interesting ride, and we'll talk through that and its implications on the global economy and trade. Everyone just needs to take a breath, and things will be okay. We'll survive collectively, and I think the economy will be better for it. But I'm just glad to be with you guys today.
Thank you, Jordan. And next up is former Congressman Kenny Holtzoff, who is a partner and chairman of Kit Bond Strategies, a business development and consulting firm where he focuses on strategic planning and providing hands-on effective advocacy. His clients include national leaders in renewable energy, the largest domestic airline carrier in the US, a Power 5 athletic conference, and the nation's largest transporter of finished vehicles and logistics. He also worked with congressional leaders and the government of Mexico on updating NAFTA and enacting the USMCA. Before joining KBS, Kenny served in the US House of Representatives from 1997 to 2009, representing Missouri's 9th Congressional District. He served on the powerful Ways and Means Committee during his entire congressional tenure and was a member of the Health and Trade subcommittees as well as the Budget Committee. He established a strong national reputation as a leader with integrity on the House Committee on Standards of Official Conduct, also known as the Ethics Committee. Kenny is a member of Missouri Main Street Connection, which enhances historic downtown business districts, and has received numerous awards from Missouri organizations for his advocacy and preservation work. He is a 1980 graduate of the University of Missouri-Columbia with a BS in Agriculture Economics and a 1983 graduate of the University of Mississippi School of Law. Kenny splits his time between Washington, D.C. and Columbia, Missouri. Congressman, over to you for a quick intro.
Thank you, Stella. Thank you to the World Trade Center. Great to be with you again. Yes, as Jordan said, these are definitely interesting times. It doesn't seem that long ago, Stella, that I actually was rattling around the halls of Capitol Hill as representing Missouri's old 9th Congressional District. And where this topic were to come up back then, the implications of global trade, and you're talking back then of President Bush with the Republican House, Republican Senate, Bob Zoellick as USTR, followed by Rob Portman. The world was a lot different then as it relates to international trade, but looking forward to this conversation about what the second Trump term looks like, and maybe some challenges, but some opportunities ahead as well, and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Congressman. And finally, but by no means least, Robert Shapiro. Robert is a partner at the law firm of Thompson Coburn, where he chairs the international trade practice. He regularly appears before Customs and Border Protection, the U.S. Department of Commerce, the U.S. International Trade Commission, the Department of State, the Federal Maritime Commission, the Office of USTR, and the United States Congress. As vice president of a major logistics firm, a licensed customs broker, and foreign freight forwarder, prior to entering the practice of law, Robert has extensive experience in the valuation, classification, and origin of imported merchandise, duty deferral and recovery, free trade agreements, and export controls governing sanctions at the Office of Foreign Assets Control, dual-use goods under the Export Administration Regulations, and munitions under ITAR. Robert has developed unique trade remedy arguments to help his clients and understands the diverse interests of the Departments of State, Defense, Homeland Security, Treasury, and the other various agencies charged with implementing international trade security measures. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and biochemistry from Connecticut College and an LLM and JD from Cornell University. Although based in D.C., he is a frequent visitor to Missouri and generously provides regular insights to the St. Louis Trade Compliance Practitioners Roundtable at their bi-monthly meetings. And I should also mention that Robert is a frequent speaker for the World Trade Center and always so giving of his time and expertise. So welcome, Robert.
Sorry, get my camera going. Thank you, Stella. It's a pleasure to be here. I enjoyed doing this in 2020, and it should be a interesting thing to do now. I think we have some experience of what the ride's going to be like, but I think there's always new twists and turns. I consider this as a bit of a roller coaster. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. So let's just kind of start at the high level. And Jordan, I guess I'll start with you. What would you say are sort of the top priorities, especially when it comes to trade for the
I mean, I think that, Susan, let's just talk about the economy, right? And obviously trade is a central focal point. I mean, it's not rocket science. All of us, the three of us, everyone on this video conference has seen it, read about it. This election came down to the economy. I think the second Trump administration is going to focus for the first year or two on righting that ship, right? I think Congress is going to focus on righting that ship, and I think, look, the challenge is for presidents, economic policy has swings and it has delays, and sometimes it catches up at the wrong time or policies that are from a couple of years ago. But part of it is how you right that ship. And I think, President Trump and his team, and we'll see who ends up being the Treasury Secretary. And I think we have a good idea who's going to be the trade rep. Either the former trade rep or one of his deputies are likely to take over at USTR. But I think, Washington's going to be focused, including on Capitol Hill. I think you'll see, and obviously like Kenny talked a lot about this from his experience on Ways and Means, but you're going to see Congress really focus on a tax and tariff package in 2025. There's not a lot of air available. Congress sometimes has struggles. I'm trying to tread lightly here, Kenny. Sometimes has struggles, walking and chewing gum at the same time. And I think the exercise of a tax package with tariffs, potentially for the first time in 100 years, is going to be all-encompassing. So maybe I'll pause there and let Kenny and Robert jump in and we'll play off that a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to tee it over to you, Kenny. Yes,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Well, and I think 2025 is very different than 2017, right? So when Donald Trump assumed the oath of office for his first term, was somewhat of an unknown commodity, particularly as it relates to international trade. And then we were surprised, that he followed through with some of those discussions about a trade war and about tariffs. This time, we have our eyes wide open going into 2025. The world is different. Congress is different. And I think you'll see probably a mix. You're going to see, in the first Trump administration, we became conversant with numbers like 201, 232, 301, all sections that the administration used and cited, for particular tariffs. Now, though, I think there is going to be a role for Congress to play, and to mention or play off of what Jordan just referenced. I mean, even just, I think yesterday, one of the DC Hill publications, Politico. So I'm not disclosing information. This has been publicly reported that Mr. Lighthizer and the transition team are now working with the Ways and Means Committee and others in Congress to see if a rule change, if a congressional rule change is going to be needed, so that not if tariffs are imposed, but when tariffs are imposed, the revenue derived from those tariffs might actually then go to pay for tax cuts and the extension of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. So as Jordan said, this this has not been done, at least in modern memory. And so I think you're going to see both administrative action and potentially some congressional action on trade policy.
Okay. Robert, you come at it from a little bit different perspective in terms of where you work. So what would you?
Well, first, I kind of challenge a little bit Jordan's assertion of righting the economic ship. I don't know if that's actually what's at play. I think there is much more at play in terms of fulfilling promises made during the campaign. I think there is a lot of at play in strengthening U.S. interests, U.S. manufacturing and production interests. One of my thoughts that I think is a direct result of the prior Trump administration is actually stronger, that labor is a bit stronger in its negotiations with management, because I think the abilities and the risks associated with offshoring production are different than they were before the first Trump administration. So I think that's where I see more of the motivation and more of the play than I do necessarily of righting the economic ship. I think the role of Congress is going to be, in some ways, how to make sure that the tariffs that are suggested are not inflationary and control what that is. And I think that's going to be the role of Congress. And it may also go into what happens to the revenue, as Kenny suggested. But I think those are sort of going to be after the fact, because I think many of the tariff actions will be imposed really early on before any congressional action. I think they'll be very fast. Some of them will have immediate effect, and I think some of them will have a more delayed effect. For example, I think with Mexico, I can certainly see executive order that authorizes the imposition of tariffs if certain actions aren't taken by Mexico. And so really making the threat explicit and using that in negotiation. I think with China, I think it's much more likely to have a tariff that has some delayed effect just for what goods that are on the water, but that would go into effect pretty quickly. And then I think with the rest of the world, and particularly with the EU, we're back into, okay, let me get the threat out there, and then that may actually punt over to Congress to look at in terms of both the tax and trade bill. That's how I see it playing out.
Let me just add to that. I mean, I think that to Kenny's point, I think I don't disagree with anything Robert said. The challenge is going to be, President Trump made a number of promises on the campaign trail, to Robert's point, about no tax on overtime, no tax on tips, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole lot of things. At some point, you're going to be north of $6 trillion in a potential tax package. Now, Republicans don't always believe that taxes have to be always offset. Tariffs will raise a de minimis amount compared to $6 trillion. So it's really not a large revenue raiser. But I think, to Kenny's point and to Robert's, I think this is going to have to be in lockstep. I looked. So the last time Congress did a tariff bill, it was 1930. It was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. And so, there is no muscle memory, of how to do in the implications of a tariff, of Congress engaging in tariff legislation. So it's gonna be interesting. And the broader picture, the 2017 Trump tax cuts, there's only about 85 members of Congress that were served in 2017 that are still here in this current Congress. I haven't looked what in the next Congress. So as quickly as they want to try to go work on a tax and tariff package, there was just not a lot of folks on Capitol Hill that have been through this before, especially on the tariff side, obviously. And so it's going to add challenges where Robert's point of, administratively, they're going to have to do some things early while Congress tries to figure this out.
Okay, I had several questions that surfaced there, but I wonder if I should maybe just let you all take it from there, because there's a couple different directions you could go from there. Kenny, is there something you'd like to?
Well, in addition to the small number in the entire House, I think you'll have I'll be fact checked on this, I'm sure, but the chairman of the committee has said publicly that there are only 5 current members of Ways and Means, Republican Ways and Means members that were on the committee back in 2017 when the tax cuts were passed. I had a flashback there, Jordan, for a minute, because Chairman Hawley, and that would be of Smoot-Hawley, not talking about our current Senator Hawley. But the portrait of Chairman Hawley was hanging in the Ways and Means room, often looking down at us, as we would have our hearings. One point that Robert made is, yes, the executive action is going to be swift. I don't know if it's going to be, did he say on day one, Robert? So January the 20th, I'm not sure or not. But the issue of China is a different entity, politics. I'm not talking about, obviously, from a factual trade perspective, but on Capitol Hill. The select committee, there was a select committee on China that was on the House that did a lot of work, very bipartisan or even nonpartisan. Mike Gallagher had been the chairman of the committee when Mike left. Now John Molinar of Michigan is the chair of the committee. And they discussed things like and got really intimate details about security matters, but on the trade issue, when Mr. Lighthizer testified, I think it was over a year ago, but it testified before the select committee, talked about, having Congress take away PNTR for China, so I mean, and so there's already going to be this confrontational stance, and certainly Congress a Republican-led Congress is going to take its views from the Republican president. But I think, Congress may weigh in some ancillary ways. Robert, you're right. I think that the President-elect Trump, is going to be driving the wagon here on trade policy. But Congress will be willing participants, particularly as it relates to being more aggressive toward the People's Republic of China.
And Kenny, you may know this, but that may be what you alluded to. Chairman Molinar introduced the revocation of the PNTR yesterday.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Can you define what PNTR is?
Permanent normalized trade relations
Thank
with
you.
China. It gives
Sorry.
China MFN status as any other WTO member. Okay. And it's argued, at least, that's a big source of some of the problems with trade with China, in that it's such a different economic structure and it's such a big economy, and that when it was allowed into the WTO to play by the rules of the more capitalistic and democratic world, that became that wasn't fully taken into how the rules under the WTO work, and China's been able to exploit that. One of the things, there's a question in the chat about tariffs being a tax on the American people, and I actually think that in some ways the tax cuts, and I look at the tax cuts and the tariffs slightly differently, in that the tax cuts are offset the inflationary impact of the tariffs. In other words, you put more money in people's pockets and it offsets the fact that they're paying more for the goods. And I think that's a part of what happened in the first Trump administration, and why we didn't see a lot of inflation resulting from the China tariffs when they originally imposed. And I think that in part that after inflation, and why prices have stayed high, is because now the baseline is raised. It is now the baseline of the production cost plus the tariffs, and you put tariffs on one country, and it adjusts all other businesses then adjust to a higher price level. And so I think that's part of how that has played out. So, but that's why I see the tax cuts as being important, because you got to offset some of that that increased tax, if you will, that is the result of the tariffs.
Well, Robert, let me jump in on this. But if you only extend the tax cuts and don't expand them, you're not putting another dent in your wallet, in people's pocketbook, right? So that those tax cuts from the last time are already built in. And if you're adding new tariffs, then the economy, I mean, that's the challenge. I've seen a lot of, we talked about this last week, preliminarily on CNBC and other places, there's been a lot of Republicans starting to talk now about the implications of tariffs on the economy. And if you don't do what Robert said and take ancillary cuts to people's, corporate tax rates, individual tax rates lower than they are now, then there will be a, potential inflationary issue. You just can't be status quo and then add 20% tariffs across the board and expect the economy to be stable.
Right. So I don't think, Trump is saying necessarily that using the tariffs to pay off current tax, to offset current taxes, it's to offset current additional tax cuts. And I see that as part of the shifting sand. The other one, and I'll throw it out to you guys. I don't know. I know in the first term, Trump had suggested a border adjustment tax. And I wonder whether that is a way to get to his promise of increased tariffs across the board to all countries, is that the U.S. puts in either a border adjustment tax or a value-added tax as a way, actually, both to fulfill that promise, but to also argue to offset the costs of the other tax cuts and other things.
Any thoughts on that?
I know it was discussed previously, right now, and again, I think, it's officially been declared that, Republicans are going to be the majority party in the House, and maybe a few more seats that might be added. Although, keep in mind, by the way, as the president continues to pluck members of the House for cabinet positions, those are not gubernatorial appointments once they're vacant. And so if you've got Elise Stefanik of New York becoming UN ambassador, and Mike Waltz of Florida being national security, and
Lee Zeldin.
Lee. Well,
I was trying to stay away from the latter.
But Matt Gaetz, suddenly now, an already slim majority becomes even, a shrinking majority, and so that's a pragmatic issue that's going to have to be dealt with at some point. But I will say too, to Robert's point, that there seems the cadence, the pace of not only the announcements, but what's happening on the Hill. Ways and Means Committee, Finance Committee, and the Senate have already begun working behind the scenes on what's called a budget reconciliation bill. And for those unfamiliar, basically, it is a way to get around the Senate filibuster when you have Republicans that vote on a budget resolution. The Senate does the same. It does not have to be signed by the president. And so this then is a tool that can be used for tax policy and trade policy. And it only requires a 51 vote majority in the Senate. So you don't have the filibuster or cloture rules and things like that. And it's what the Democratic side has done very effectively too, on the infrastructure bill, Inflation Reduction Act, going back to the Affordable Care Act called Obamacare. All of those were done through budget reconciliation. And Robert, you're right. They already now they haven't gotten into the specifics, like, do we do a border adjustment tax? Do we take the laundry list of campaign promises of the incoming president? And do we need to include all the things that Jordan mentioned? So those specifics haven't, they've been working on it a little bit. One other interesting, again, if you're on the tax world, the state and local deduction, tax deduction that was taken away in 2017. That's a very bipartisan group, a coalition that wants to try to restore that SALT tax deduction. It's a huge coster as far as revenue that would be required. So all of these things are kind of in the pot. and haven't been stirred yet. But I could very well see, Robert, where a border adjustment tax might be one of those specific policies, because they're going to be looking under the seat cushions and everything else to try to find some revenue to offset, as Jordan mentioned. And this could very well be one of those things that's in play.
Look, that's the challenge here, right? So the great part for Missouri is the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Everyone I think on this call probably knows this, but the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee is Jason Smith from Salem, Missouri, but from Southeast Missouri, from the 8th Congressional District. I think Kenny and I, a lot of people probably know where Salem is. But so, we've got one of our own who's writing, is going to have one of them, pens on this legislation. I think to Kenny's point, the challenge is on tax and trade policy is for everybody who wants to do something, there's somebody who wants to do something else. And to Kenny's point, even without the House members being plucked to the administration, President Trump told Speaker Johnson yesterday, he doesn't care how many he takes. It's not his problem. He wants the people he wants in his administration. But I think, it looks like because everybody's taking our safe Republican seats, will just take about 90 to 120 days for a special election to happen to replace them. But it probably ends up 221 to 214, I think is the number, pretty close within a seat either way. So you have a 7-vote, 4-member flip. So for every pay for, if it's a tariff on something, unless it's across the board, if it is a repeal of a clean energy provision that was in a Democratic bill, if it's SALT, like Kenny said, as actually not a pay for, but an actual cost, you only need 5 members to break with the Republican Party to cause Chairman Smith and the Speaker a problem. And so that is even more complicated, where with such slim majorities in the House, back to Kenny's SALT issue, if they don't fix SALT issue, it's really a big issue for New York Republicans and Orange County Republicans. And we may be down one Orange County Republican by the end of the week, may only be one left. And then we lost a few Republicans in New York as well, but you still have a big enough block to cause problems. Back to trade and tariffs, in one of our rags we all read this morning, there was talk of the new gold rush is finding folks to work on exempting tariffs for your pick the product. We've all got clients lined up through the wazoo. I don't represent Apple, but there was a big conversation about the last Trump administration. All the component parts of iPhones were exempted from all of the China tariffs, or most of them, or they were de minimis compared to others. But that is the new kind of paradigm we're in, where folks are actively going to ensure that, particularly on China, things that are coming in this country aren't over tariffed and just become difficult to produce or import from there.
Jordan, one of the things I think is really interesting on what happened last time and then what's happened in between with the Biden administration on the tariffs, the China tariffs and exclusions, and what we are likely to expect again in the future. So I think the first time what you said about Apple is right. There were others who got exclusions, and the exclusions really were, I will say, more lobbying based instead of legal and policy based. And then Biden was really doing and Ambassador Tai really looking at legal and policy. So they did exclusions on machinery that is needed to do manufacturing in the US. So really focusing on what do you got to do to really build that manufacturing base. And that was the logic behind doing exclusions. I think we're going to be back to a logic that is going to be more strongly lobbying based and less strongly policy based on bringing things back. And that's why in some ways in the first Trump administration, you got more nearshoring, perhaps, or maybe some divestment from China, but not bringing back to the U.S. And I think that there needs to be a matchup of those two, a merger of those two ideas at some point in terms of a public policy.
And there is talk of using the tax policy to do exactly what you said, Robert, of incentivizing business tax cuts would be based on bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. And so it won't be a pure, it'll be a bonus, whatever, if you do X, Y, and Z domestically.
I don't know how you then deal with, because I think one of the things that you see in NAFTA is, let's say, and I think it extends here. Let's say a Chinese car company said, great, I will produce those cars here in the US. Will we give them that same
Right.
tax benefit?
Well, that's part of the Biden, the
Right.
IRA.
And
Yeah.
so this idea of, I worry about the insertion of a origin rule based on where the headquarters of a business is or what the ownership of a business is. And then you're blending sort of our sanctions laws with our import laws. And one more point I just want to make real quick, because we referenced Smoot-Hawley a couple times without referencing the role it played. It didn't cause the Great Depression, but
Okay, I was going to say there's a question in here. I'm going to bring it.
And so I would say that, especially with Kenny's statement about Senator Hawley in the conference room or in the meeting room, and I think that staring down, and it strikes me that if I was sitting in the halls of Congress, I'm going to go, oh wait, we're going to pass a tariff bill. I don't want to do what that guy did. How do I do this without any institutional knowledge on how to pass a tariff bill? So it just struck me as really something that we needed to touch on.
By the way, and for those of you who come to Washington, D.C., and Jordan be a great tour guide, by the way, I'm just kidding. The Ways and Means hearing room, the portraits of former chairmen go up there. And don't forget, Robert, that Mr. Rostenkowski,
Right.
his big portrait is also up there. So some very notable names of former chairs for sure.
So thank you. I do want to cover just a couple of things that are in the questions, just because we've been talking about tax cuts versus tariffs. And the first question here was tariffs will be a tax on American businesses who do the actual importing. You've kind of addressed that, Robert. And then the other one was tax cuts benefit high-income individuals. Tariffs punish low-income individuals whose spending actually drive economic growth. Does that get covered by these kind of back and forth that you were talking about potentially tying those together? And then the other question about Smoot-Hawley being disastrous policy, you addressed the first part of that. This might be a secondary question after, like we wrap up the tax versus tariff comment, but there is also a question in there about how, what about existing free trade agreements in place with allies and other nations? And I also would not mind if you kind of could give an overview of, so here were the tariffs that Trump put in place when he was in office the first time, and then Biden left a lot of those in place, but not all of them. And then what do you envision it's going to look like then? Is he adding to some of those that are in there? So I don't know which of those things you want to try to address first, but I think we could maybe sort of wrap up the tax discussion. Who wants to jump in?
Go ahead, Robert.
Well, I wasn't going to wrap up the tax discussion.
Well, I think, Kenny, you could say something about the tax just because of being on the Ways and Means.
Yeah. So, I think, it's, as Jordan mentioned, I think partly dependent upon the majority. And if reconciliation happens, which again, I think Republicans are pretty focused on that occurring, there's going to be, because here's the thing, as Jordan alluded to earlier, if Congress does nothing, then at the end of 2025, tax rates go up, corporate rates, individual rates, the standard deduction that was, the increased standard deduction from 2017 goes away. And so again, everything reverts back to the way things were prior to the tax cuts going into effect in 2017. Jason Smith, Chairman Smith, has referenced 2025 as the Super Bowl of tax discussion. And so there's going to be a lot of discussion, I think, about tax. But as we're talking, and so let's leave that in the rearview mirror, though. And I think one of the questions, Susan, you referenced was about free trade agreements. Interestingly, and I'm not, Robert, if you can, I'm going to be over my skis here very quickly, and I understand that. So USMCA, which took NAFTA's place, does have a sunset or a mandatory review, and that's going to be in July of 2026. And so, there is going to be a lot of focus. And again, these same two committees we talked about, the Ways and Means Committee, which has jurisdiction over trade, and the Senate Finance Committee similarly. And so there's also then going to be a deep look at the implications and the data from the implementation of USMCA. And I don't know what is, Robert, again, I'll tee it up for you for whatever comments you might have, because a lot of that's going to be looked at in 2025, even though ultimately I think in July of 2026 is when that mandatory review has to happen.
Yeah, so I think, Trump tried to put additional tariffs on Mexico in his first term, and the business community was up in arms because the two economies are really closely integrated for some really major industries. So I think it became a bit of a third rail that way, and the way to get changes to it was renegotiation. So and I think I see both Mexico and the United States, Canada to a lesser degree, already setting the stage for this renegotiation. So there's a lot of things that SAT in Mexico is doing to get more information and to clamp down on things, a lot of things that Customs is doing. So I think there's a renegotiation. I could see one of the big things done in USMCA is change to some labor provisions and some quick dispute resolution processes on labor issues. And actually, the first one was done against GM Mexico on how much labor was paid. And they've done a lot to the auto industry to require a labor value content as opposed to just a regional value content. And I could see some of that expanding. That way, you kind of leave USMCA in place, which, by the way, has got 3 different names depending on which country you're in, right? It's CUMSA in Canada, because Canada has to be first, and it's TMEX in Mexico. So, anyway, that's an aside. But so I can see that happening to strengthen those provisions. It will limit the benefit of USMCA, but without crushing what that business relationship is across that border or those borders.
And look, I think the broader, to kind of weave all those questions together a little bit, Susan, I think the broader question is, does President Trump want to use these as a negotiating tool to get something done? He tried that with China in 2017. He made a lot of progress. China made a lot of commitments that they didn't follow through on. And so, is it, we ran into this with the digital tax collection in France, where we had to put tariffs on, we were on cheese and champagne and all these things as the kind of new world order of digital taxation comes throughout Europe and how it impacts, US companies. And I think that's the big question. I think, is this threat's the wrong word because it's clearly a threat, but is it a way to get folks to the table to renegotiate, to get what Mr. Lighthizer and his, folks, or whomever the next trade rep is, and the president and his economic team, a more fair trade policy for the U.S. products globally. And so that's a big if. I mean, I think that's where it probably starts. And when he doesn't feel like he's making progress, it ends up in a very different way, in a larger response from the U.S., from USTR and others.
One of the questions in the chat has to do with ag policy for the ag community for the U.S. ag community, and that was the major thing that that Trump in the first term negotiated with China was the purchase of additional U.S. ag product. the side, I think one of the side effects was also that China developed different supply chains for some of its agricultural products. So it actually increased the competition that the US has getting into those markets, which is interesting. So it's whether, so the trade-off, I think, is already different in that negotiation with China or with anyone else on using tariffs as a way to open markets. The irony also is that it's sort of the inverse of what U.S. trade policy has been in for years, which was was a trade-off of opening for opening. We're trying to do a trade-off of closing for opening. And that's a different way to work. What the WTO and others were founded on was this idea of opening for opening. I think there's still that negotiating play, and I think that will be what's exercised. But I don't know for a country other than China, because and only China because of centralized economy, or any other centralized economy, where you can negotiate all this additional buying of U.S. goods, right? You can't do that to Europe.
Cuba.
Right, you could do it to Cuba, but you can't do it to
Some more
Europe.
eggs.
You have to have them lower the tariff barriers to do that, and you got to give them something for that. And it's interesting to create this barrier as something you trade off.
And you're correct, Robert, that renegotiated with China additional purchase of ag products. But let me go to the question itself. And Jordan will laugh because he knows Susan, about 2 hours south of you, we have our family farm is 1,000-acre corn, wheat, and soybean farm. And I would be much more comfortable without the suit with the jeans and a farm cap on. But before that renegotiation, I mean, the farm economy got clobbered. I think farm economy about $27 billion that were lost because of the trade war. And then, of course, we got government handouts, which as a conservative, I cashed my check. But
of course you did.
But I mean, it was the only thing seriously though, it was the only thing that stemmed us from the first production year to the second one was by having, the CCC payment. So, and I had a conversation, I won't mention his name because I didn't ask him if I could, but somebody that's on the Trump transition team in the ag sector looking at the next ag secretary and who that might be. And I said, surely, please tell me that we're not headed in, with soybeans already under $10 a bushel, surely we're not going to head for another trade war. And this individual on the transition side said, hopefully not, hopefully that, Trump's a known commodity now. And maybe, that, the old speak softly and carry a big stick as it relates to trade. And therefore, maybe we can renegotiate. But Robert, as you said, who else can purchase more of our goods other than the People's Republic of China? As far as
Secretary Hulshoff, is that what I'm hearing? Ag Secretary Hulshoff, right here, making news.
As I told Susan earlier, I was not on Trump Force One. Perhaps so if I'd gotten on the plane yesterday, but no.
Well, and the other one is, now you have Brazil and other countries really eating into that Chinese and other markets as a result of the trade war, and so those are going to make that's going to be some real complications in here.
I mean, but also we didn't talk about, from the transition from 17 to 16 to 20 to 24 is post-COVID. And back to Robert's point earlier about re-onshoring things from other parts of the world, right? We also forget how, we've, I think, all blocked out a little bit how, April, May of 2020, the challenge of getting supplies through 20, through 21 and 22, first, supplies for hospitals and whatnot that will come from China. And then as people started buying stuff because they had nothing else to do, all other products that come from overseas. And I think the hangover effect of that and how we handle tariffs and trade and tax policy, I think will be part, there will be some muscle memory for that, of why we need to make sure that we do this the right way to ensure that this stuff happens as domestic as we can to not push us other places and just move out of China and go to Vietnam or somewhere else, but really try to bring some of this stuff back domestically.
So Jordan, you point out something that actually I've been thinking about also. I think a lot of companies are starting, in fear of the trade wars, are going to rush their imports right now. Okay, get them in before February. And that's going to have an impact on freight rates, on what it costs to ship goods from Asia to the U.S. or anywhere to the U.S. The availability. We're going to have a similar bubble where there's stuff in inventory that needs to be sold off, but it had these high freight rates. That's stuff that that's what we went through. First we had the contraction right after COVID, and then we had this what we're just finally are getting through, I think, which is the excess inventory and spending that off. We've created this a much bigger accordion effect than the economy would normally have.
And look, other countries are going to pick up the slack. I mean, there's an article this morning about Modi and Trump and their love affair with each other in India. And so India understanding, like, we're an ally, and we figure out, well, compared to China, they're still an ally, made it, but different challenges in the economy. But other countries throughout Asia saying, like, pick me, and try to rejigger the.
But I think we're likely to see a game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
Okay, so China is less of a threat. Now it's Vietnam or Thailand or India or name your country. Mexico is already one. And so I think we're seeing this game of whack-a-mole that may play out.
Yeah, I would love to kind of take a tour of the whole world and see what you have to say about different regions. But maybe these two other questions that we've sort of nibbled around the edges on is just, any potential multilateral or bilateral free trade agreements, or is it all just gonna be, I think maybe you've addressed that already, Robert, it's all going to be.
There's your answer.
And then, all right,
We couldn't do one during the Biden administration. We're not going to do one now. Trade agreements.
And then retaliation.
The U.S. North Korea free trade agreement.
Oh my gosh. And so then retaliation, the other question here, right? How do you expect China, EU, and other trading partners to react and or retaliate when the U.S. raises tariffs? So it'd be good to talk about that. And then could we just sort of take a quick look over the whole rest of the world, like Middle East, Africa, any of those? Is there going to be any kind of things to note about the incoming administration for that?
To me, one of the ironies is a border adjustment tax or VAT will have less of a reaction from the rest of the world. Okay, so that's why I keep coming back to it. It seems to me one of these logical things that we will end up with, because it's a way to get, as I said before, to get some of those promises in on tariffs on everyone. I think this reciprocal tariff act is likely also that gives the president some authority. But a VAT or a border adjustment tax, no one can object to. They all have it, and it's not targeting. We're not using something. Okay, we're not using something trumped up like that Europe is a threat to our national security, so that we can put tariffs on steel and aluminum from Europe. We're not using something like that. We're using, okay, this is what the world has done, and we're treated unfairly with it. We're gonna respond in kind. So that's one I see that has less impact from retaliation. Otherwise, I do think there'll be retaliatory actions by any country impacted.
And look, I'll start with the world. I'll start with Africa, right? I think, Kenny, we did AGOA when you were in Congress, right? It was the African, I just wrote a Growth and Opportunity Act. This was probably cutting edge 25 years ago, 30 years ago, whenever we passed it. But China has invested throughout Africa where we have not. We've given them duty-free. We've given them, tried to do trade deals with them, but have not made significant investment. China has made investment in ports. They've made investment in other things. And I think we are going to lose, if we haven't already lost that entire continent, if we don't catch up very quickly.
So let me, two points, one global and one kind of back to domestic policy. Let's not forget, and we don't have the time here today, but geopolitical events. And so, for instance, our relationship with Taiwan, which under the Biden administration has been quite strong. The President Biden has made some statements so strong, in fact, that we would defend them, that staff has had to walk those back on occasion. President Trump does not, and this is my editorial view, at least my reading of it, doesn't have that same strong defense of Taiwan. Much more insular. And I think that's just his belief about foreign policy and using our military generally. Does that have some impact as it relates to trade with China? And the other thing I would say, looking back at some policies that were not tax policies necessarily, but like the CHIPS Act, something Robert, you said a while ago that I think is not being talked about a lot nationally, and that is our supply chain. There were some efforts, the CHIPS Act being one. There were some provisions in the infrastructure bill a couple of years ago, some monies to try to help bring those manufacturing processes back here. And again, it's that one of my first votes way back was on MFN for China. And, people have asked, if you had that vote again, would you have voted the same way? And one of the unintended consequences of allowing China to go into the World Trade Organization was we sort of dusted off our hands and said, okay, we don't care where our supply chains are on solar panels and chips and what have you. Now there's a renewed interest because we see our national security interest is intertwined with those supply chains, and we can't undo them, right? We can't just flip a switch and say, okay, we're going to start making this stuff here. We'd like to see the domestic manufacturing. And I know that's what the incoming president wants to say. Let's bring manufacturing back here. But part of that is it the carrot or is it the stick? Do you want to incent people to do that? And that's what the CHIPS Act tried to do. Or are we going to do it more of a stick approach? And that is through this conversation we've just had. And that is through very onerous trade or tariff policy.
Yeah, and Kenny, just to touch briefly on one thing you raised, I think because we didn't talk about the national security side of trade very much, and I don't see the Trump administration as interested in some of those aspects of it as Biden has been. And the CHIPS Act being one of them is really, here's this national security piece that we have to redo here and really encourage to happen here, as opposed to what you said on the stick side of it. And same thing, I could see part of a negotiation, great, we'll let go of some of these controls we have on advanced computer systems to China if you buy more soybeans. And I worry about some of those. Same with AI controls and things like that.
Yeah.
I worry about some of that aspect of the transaction. What we're likely to see.
That's a whole session.
Yeah, we didn't even get to that. And we've got, believe it or not, we have 2 minutes left in the webinar and we like to end promptly. So I was hoping to get a chance for each of you to sort of say wrap up comments, but we could certainly go on for another 2 or 3 hours. Really, really appreciate the comments, and we really kind of answered the questions as we went. These were excellent questions. I appreciate everybody's questions. There is another question in there that we unfortunately won't have a chance to get to, but there are also, we will send a recording out of this to everybody who was on everybody who registered. There are a couple of other links that we would probably include that can help flesh out some of the things that you all had brought up and discussed. Thank you very much for all those comments and your insights. We are just about wrapped up, but I did want to give everyone a heads up for there will be an evaluation that comes to you after the end of the webinar. And then on our monthly speaker series in December will be on Thursdays, December 12th. And it's going to be a topic we've been wanting to talk about for quite some time, which is international e-commerce. And then in January, as we often do, we will be doing an economic outlook. We don't have a date scheduled for that, but given all of the changes with the incoming administration, it should be an interesting discussion also to look out over the coming year of 2025 and see what could be ahead of us globally on the economy side. And I guess that's all I had to say. I just really appreciate everybody's input and the questions, and we loved what you said at the beginning, Kenny, that everything will be okay. We're just gonna kind of hold on. I know some people are elated about the election and others are very upset. So you know, hopefully we will all get through this and have a good result. So thank you all.
Thank you.
And happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.